Hello, viewers, and welcome to another edition of Jehovah's Witness Questions Answered. And I'm Brian Pope, and I've never been a Jehovah's Witness, but I do love them and love to talk with them and interact with them. And I don't consider myself an apostate or an opposer, or like I'm trying to trip you up or anything like that if you're a Jehovah's Witness. I just enjoy looking at scriptures together and seeing what God has to say to us apart from what any man-made organization might tell us. So anyway, I have a question that has been asked of me, and the question is, why are Jehovah's Witnesses so seemingly hung up about a certain date, a certain year, and that year being 1914? Why are Jehovah's Witnesses so caught up? Why is 1914 such an important year for them? Because it appears in what they tell you, and it appears in their literature over and over again. It's a very significant date to them. In fact, it's very pivotal for them. It's the foundation of their whole system. But why 1914? And if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you've been learning in your history as they teach you that 1914 was a very significant year to the original Bible students. They saw it as an important year. And that's true. But what they don't tell you is what they believed about that year at the time. And I'll come back to that if I remember, and tell you what they did believe about it at the time. So 1914 is significant, and it goes back to the history of the organization. Way back toward the end of the 19th century, late 1800s, there were a group of people. It was part of the Advent movement, and this is the common trunk of Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and some others, Christadelphians to name some. They have a common trunk. They originally worked together. So you had William Miller and Nelson Barber. Nelson Barber worked closely with Pastor Russell of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were friends, and they published some things together. They later had a disagreement and parted ways. But the calculations to get to the year 1914 as being significant came from this Advent movement. And Miller and Barber have some charts that you can look up, and you'll see this date, 1914. You'll see some other dates. The original date was 1843. And these were predictions that Jesus would return. It would be the end of all things. So first 1843, and then 1889, 1914, 1925. And so when Jesus didn't return on those dates, you had the great disappointment. And then these various groups who had split from each other came up with ways to explain. And so they all came up with their own version of, well, Jesus didn't return as we thought, but it still is a very significant year. And so then they had to come up with, well, what was significant about it? For the Seventh-day Adventists, it became the year that Jesus came and cleansed the temple, and they have their doctrine called the investigative judgment. For Jehovah's Witnesses, this gets confusing. You can look up any of these things on your own. For the Jehovah's Witnesses, 1914 is the year they latched onto, and they said the significance of it was Jesus returned. He came invisibly to evaluate all of the churches, all the religious groups, and determine which was the true organization that Jehovah and Jesus approved of. And of course, for them, it's the Jehovah's Witness organization. And so 1914. Well, how did they get at this year, 1914? Well, this can get confusing, but there's a prophecy in the book of Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar, a king of a pagan nation, as a punishment, he is driven insane by God, and he goes out and spends 7 years out in the fields like a wild animal or like cattle. So he's out for 7 years in the pastures and just being clinically insane. 7 years. And so they said, well, this had its fulfillment back then with this king that was restored after 7 years to his rulership. But there's a secondary interpretation, and it has to do with the end times. And so they take that 7 years when this kingdom is put on hold and then restored, and they say, well, that's a symbol of God's kingdom, God's rulership that was put on hold for a symbolic 7 years. And so they take this 7 years, and it begins then with the time of the Gentiles in the temple. The Gentiles would trample the temple for a symbolic 7 years. So beginning back from when the temple was overtaken in Jerusalem, then they say there's a symbolic 7 years. So how do they get to 1914 with only 7 years? Well, it's a symbolic 7 years. And if you go to, I'm looking at some notes here because it gets confusing. If you go to, actually these notes are from jw.org, from their website. In their online library, they say in Revelation and other places, there are 3.5 times mentioned. And we understand that to be 3.5 years. People generally accept that. 3.5 times is 3.5 years. And it's said that 3.5 times is equal to 1,260 days. It says that in the book of Revelation. It's 3.5 times, 42 months, 1,260 days. That's biblical. So then they go back to Daniel 4. You've got 7 years. And how long is a Jewish year? Well, by the Jewish calendar, it's 360 days. So you take that 7 years in Daniel, multiply that by 360 days, and you come up with 2,520 years. And there's a principle that they claim calling a day for a year principle. A day for a year. Because also in Daniel, in Ezekiel, that prophet is told to lie on his side for a certain number of days, and Israel would be punished for the same number of years. So however many days, they'd be punished for that many years. So a day stands for a year. So if you have 2,520 days, that stands for 2,520 years. So from the time that the temple was overtaken, you add 2,520 years, and it comes out to the year 1914. If you start at their correct, what they consider the correct year. So from various adjustments, that's how they came up with first 1843, then 1889, 1914, 1925. So 1914 was the year that Jehovah's Witnesses cling to. And that's when Jesus came, evaluated churches, determined the correct one, which they say now is the Jehovah's Witness organization. So this year, 1914, is vital for them. And they will tell you, well, look at the year. That's when everything changed. You had World War I, the first worldwide war. And there's various diseases, all kinds of things happened beginning in 1914. Everything changed. So that's what they will say to you. So I have advice for non-Jehovah's Witnesses and for Jehovah's Witnesses, if you'll receive it. So my advice, if you're not a JW, and you get to this part of their teaching where they talk about 1914, to us as outsiders, it sounds so ridiculous. like we would say, I don't see the year 1914 in the Bible, and you've come up with all this convoluted math to come up with 1914 based on a prophecy that we see the fulfillment right there in Scripture. There's no second meaning, so we think it's ridiculous. But if you're a non-Jehovah's Witness interacting with a Jehovah's Witness, please, I ask you, do not ridicule what they're telling you. Do not ridicule them. Please be respectful. Please be kind. The best thing you can do is when they get to this part of their teaching, especially if they're going through one of their books with you, and they get to this 1914 thing, don't laugh, don't ridicule, be kind. The best thing you can do is to just ask them to explain it in their own words. Can you say to them, can you help me understand? This is so new to me. I've never seen anything like this, that the Bible would talk about something happening in 1914. Would you explain how you get to the year 1914 from this story in Daniel chapter 4? Please show me the math. Show me the calculation. How does that work? And let them try to explain it, because quite frankly, to the average Jehovah's Witness, it's confusing to them too, and they don't really fully understand it. Now, some of them are very smart, very sharp. They've researched a lot because they wanted to find out how this works, and they'll have the whole explanation, but very few of them will. Most of them will kind of try to stumble through some explanation with you, and that's fine. Let them do that. Let them do that. Don't interrupt except for real legitimate questions for clarification, but let them explain the whole thing to you. And the hope is that they will hear themselves talking and realize how strange it is, how ridiculous it may sound to an outsider. Let them try to explain it and let it bother them. So that's what to do if you're a non-Jehovah's Witness. If you are a Jehovah's Witness, my advice, if you'll have it, is to research this on your own. Ask yourself, not just the math about the years, but research, where did the Jehovah's Witness organization come up with this year 1914? And look into the history. The history that they've presented to you is very abbreviated, very sanitized, very simplified, and not entirely altogether truthful. They've omitted things. They will say things like that the early Bible students looked ahead to 1914 as a very significant year. And that's true. But here I am coming back to what was significant to the Bible students about the year 1914. And to Charles Russell. What were they teaching at the time that would happen in 1914? And you may have to go off script. You may have to go outside the publications that are approved to you. But there's places you can get Russell's writings. You can get what the students taught, and for real. And what they taught basically was that in 1914, that would be when the Armageddon would happen, and when the 1,000-year reign of Christ would begin. The churches would be abolished. That's what would happen in 1914. Don't take my word for it on this. Do the research, look into it for yourself, and you'll find it to be true. And ask yourself, why are they hiding this from us? Why are they not telling us this information? So that's my advice to you. And I hope you've enjoyed this and my feeble attempts to try to explain the year 1914. And take care. God bless you. And find truth and joy and love in Jehovah and Jesus as found in the Scripture. Take care. Bye-bye.